Have you ever met someone who claims to be deeply spiritual, who speaks of divine connections and higher purposes, yet something in your gut tells you to be cautious? Have you ever encountered a person who wraps themselves in sacred language and holy intentions, but leaves you feeling drained, confused, or spiritually manipulated? The truth is, not everyone who speaks of God, angels, or spiritual awakening is genuinely sent by divine forces. Some people use spirituality as a mask to hide their true intentions. And recognizing these deceptive patterns can protect you from spiritual manipulation and false guidance. Carl Jung, the renowned psychologist and student of the human psyche, understood that spiritual experiences could be both genuine and deeply deceptive. He spoke of the shadow archetype, that hidden part of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge, and how it can manifest even in those who claim to be the most enlightened. Jung warned that some of the most dangerous individuals are those who believe themselves to be spiritually superior while remaining completely unconscious of their own darkness. When someone uses spirituality to manipulate, control, or exploit others, they are not operating from divine love, but from their unintegrated shadow. Today, I will reveal 7 unmistakable spiritual red flags that will help you distinguish between genuine spiritual guidance and dangerous spiritual deception. These signs are subtle but powerful, and recognizing them could save you from falling into the trap of false prophets, spiritual narcissists, and energy vampires who disguise themselves as angels of light. Be especially careful about red flag number 7, as it represents the most sophisticated form of spiritual manipulation and could completely change how you evaluate the spiritual people in your life. Before we begin this crucial exploration, be sure to subscribe to the Carl Jung's Inner Sanctum channel and make sure to turn on the notifications so you don't miss our future videos on spiritual discernment and psychological awareness. These teachings could be the difference between genuine spiritual growth and devastating spiritual abuse. Now, let's unveil these 7 critical warning signs. The first red flag is spiritual superiority disguised as humility. Genuine spiritual teachers and guides exhibit authentic humility because they understand that the more they learn about the divine, the more they realize how little they truly know. However, false spiritual guides often display a subtle but persistent sense of superiority while pretending to be humble. They speak in ways that position themselves as more enlightened, more connected to divine truth, or more spiritually advanced than others around them. This spiritual arrogance manifests in several ways. They might say things like, "God revealed this special truth to me," or "I've been chosen to share this sacred knowledge," or "Most people aren't ready for this level of spiritual understanding, but you seem different." While these statements might seem humble on the surface, they actually establish a hierarchy where the speaker positions themselves as spiritually superior. They create an exclusive club of spiritual elites, and they are always at the top. Watch for phrases that subtly separate people into spiritual categories. False guides often speak of awakened versus unawakened people, chosen versus ordinary souls, or advanced versus beginner spiritual students. While spiritual growth certainly involves different levels of understanding, genuine teachers focus on lifting others up rather than creating divisions that elevate their own status. Jung understood that true spiritual maturity involves the integration of all aspects of the self, including our shadows and imperfections. Those who claim spiritual perfection or superiority are often the ones most disconnected from their own inner work. They project their unacknowledged darkness onto others while maintaining a false image of spiritual purity. If someone makes you feel spiritually inadequate or suggests that they have access to divine truths that others don't, this is a major red flag. The second red flag involves the manipulation of fear and urgency around spiritual matters. Authentic spiritual guidance operates from love, peace, and divine timing, but false spiritual teachers often use fear-based tactics to control and manipulate their followers. They create artificial urgency around spiritual decisions, claiming that immediate action is required to avoid spiritual disaster or to catch a limited divine opportunity. You might hear statements like, "The universe is testing you right now, and if you don't act immediately, you'll miss your spiritual destiny," or "Dark forces are trying to prevent you from receiving this blessing, so you must commit today," or "This spiritual opportunity won't come again in this lifetime." These fear-based approaches are designed to bypass your natural discernment and pressure you into making decisions without proper reflection or consultation with trusted advisors. Genuine spiritual teachers understand that real spiritual growth happens in divine timing and cannot be rushed or forced. They encourage careful consideration, prayer, meditation, and seeking multiple perspectives before making important spiritual decisions. They never use fear, scarcity, or time pressure to manipulate spiritual choices because they trust that authentic divine guidance will be confirmed through multiple channels and will feel peaceful in your spirit. False spiritual guides also use fear to maintain control over their followers. They might suggest that questioning their authority means you're spiritually immature, that leaving their guidance will result in spiritual disaster, or that outside influences are trying to lead you astray from your true path. This creates a closed system where the false teacher becomes the only trusted source of spiritual truth, isolating followers from other perspectives and making them increasingly dependent on the manipulator's guidance. Jung recognized that fear-based spirituality often stems from the teacher's own unresolved anxieties and need for control. When someone cannot trust the divine process in their own life, they tend to create artificial structures of control around spiritual matters. If someone is using fear, urgency, or exclusivity to pressure your spiritual decisions, this is a clear sign that they are not operating from genuine divine love. The third red flag is the demand for unquestioning obedience disguised as faith or surrender. Authentic spiritual guidance encourages discernment, personal relationship with the divine, and the development of your own spiritual intuition. However, false spiritual teachers often demand blind obedience while framing this requirement as a test of faith, surrender, or spiritual maturity. They might say things like, "True faith means not questioning divine guidance," or "Your resistance to my instructions shows you're not fully surrendered to God," or "The divine speaks through me, so questioning my guidance is questioning God himself." These statements are designed to shut down your natural spiritual discernment and make you dependent on their interpretation of divine will rather than developing your own direct relationship with the divine. Genuine spiritual teachers encourage questions, support your personal spiritual development, and help you strengthen your own connection to divine guidance. They understand that healthy spiritual growth involves learning to discern divine truth for yourself, not simply accepting someone else's claims about what God wants for your life. They welcome scrutiny, encourage you to pray about their guidance, and support you in seeking confirmation through multiple spiritual sources. False spiritual guides often become defensive, angry, or manipulative when their authority is questioned. They might accuse you of being rebellious, spiritually immature, or influenced by dark forces when you express doubts or ask for clarification. This reaction reveals that their authority is based on human control rather than divine truth, because authentic divine guidance can withstand any amount of scrutiny and questioning. Watch for demands that you cut off relationships with people who question the spiritual teacher's authority. False guides often isolate their followers from family, friends, or other spiritual advisors who might provide alternative perspectives. They frame this isolation as necessary for spiritual purity or protection from negative influences, but it's actually a control mechanism designed to prevent outside input that might expose their deception. Jung understood that authentic spiritual authority comes from embodying divine love and wisdom, not from demanding submission or obedience. Those who must demand respect or obedience rarely deserve it, while those who truly embody spiritual maturity naturally inspire trust and followership through their character and example. The fourth red flag involves the exploitation of vulnerability for personal gain. Genuine spiritual guides understand that people often seek spiritual guidance during their most vulnerable moments, and they treat this trust as sacred. However, false spiritual teachers specifically target vulnerable individuals and exploit their pain, confusion, or desperation for personal, financial, or emotional gain. This exploitation can take many forms. Financial exploitation involves demanding money, donations, or expensive spiritual services while claiming that giving demonstrates faith or spiritual commitment. They might suggest that your financial sacrifice will result in spiritual or material blessings, or that refusing to give shows a lack of trust in divine provision. Emotional exploitation involves creating inappropriate intimate relationships, demanding excessive personal information, or using people's secrets and vulnerabilities to maintain control over them. Sexual exploitation is unfortunately common among false spiritual teachers who use their perceived spiritual authority to manipulate followers into inappropriate relationships. They might claim that sexual interaction with them is a form of spiritual initiation, divine blessing, or necessary for spiritual advancement. Any spiritual teacher who suggests that sexual contact is part of spiritual growth or divine will is operating from their own shadow rather than authentic spiritual authority. False guides also exploit people's emotional vulnerabilities by creating dependency relationships where followers become addicted to the teacher's approval, attention, or guidance. They might provide intense spiritual experiences, prophetic words, or healing encounters that create an emotional high, then withdraw this attention to maintain control and keep followers seeking more validation from them. Watch for spiritual teachers who seem particularly drawn to people experiencing crisis, trauma, or major life transitions. While genuine guides certainly minister to people during difficult times, false teachers specifically seek out vulnerable individuals because they are easier to manipulate and control. They might love bomb new followers with excessive attention and spiritual validation, then gradually introduce controlling or exploitative behaviors once the person becomes emotionally dependent. Jung recognized that authentic spiritual power comes from serving others rather than being served by them. Genuine spiritual guides are more concerned with your spiritual welfare than with what you can provide for them. They maintain appropriate boundaries, refuse inappropriate gifts or payments, and always direct attention toward divine truth rather than toward themselves. I sincerely hope that you are finding this exploration of spiritual discernment helpful and eye-opening. If so, to support our channel and this important work of spiritual education, you can leave a donation with your super thanks below the video. We will be infinitely grateful for your support in helping us reach more people with these crucial teachings. Now let's continue with red flag number 5. The fifth red flag is the distortion of sacred texts and spiritual principles for personal agenda. Authentic spiritual teachers have deep respect for sacred wisdom and present spiritual truths in their proper context, acknowledging the complexity and mystery of divine revelation. However, false spiritual guides often twist scriptures, spiritual teachings, or divine principles to support their own agenda or to justify behavior that contradicts genuine spiritual values. This distortion can be subtle but devastating. They might take biblical verses, spiritual quotes, or divine principles out of context to support their demands for money, obedience, or inappropriate behavior. For example, they might use scriptures about giving to justify excessive financial demands, or twist teachings about submission to demand unquestioning obedience to their personal preferences rather than to divine will. False teachers often create their own unique interpretations of spiritual truth that conveniently align with their personal desires or needs. They might claim to have received special revelation that contradicts established spiritual wisdom or suggest that traditional interpretations of sacred texts are outdated or incorrect. While genuine spiritual insight certainly can provide fresh understanding of eternal truths, be cautious of teachers who consistently interpret spiritual principles in ways that benefit themselves or that contradict the overall spirit of love, humility, and service found in authentic spiritual traditions. Watch for the selective use of spiritual principles. False guides often emphasize spiritual concepts that support their authority while ignoring or downplaying principles that would challenge their behavior. They might speak extensively about faith and obedience while rarely mentioning humility, accountability, or servant leadership. They might emphasize divine blessing and prosperity while avoiding discussions of sacrifice, selflessness, or caring for the poor and vulnerable. Another warning sign is the creation of spiritual hierarchies or systems that place the false teacher in a position of permanent authority. They might establish elaborate spiritual rankings, initiation processes, or inner circles that always position them at the top of the spiritual food chain. While mentorship and spiritual maturity certainly exist, genuine spiritual authority is characterized by empowering others to develop their own direct relationship with the divine rather than creating permanent dependency on human intermediaries. Jung understood that authentic spiritual wisdom is characterized by consistency, coherence, and alignment with universal principles of love and truth. When someone consistently interprets spiritual principles in ways that serve their own interests rather than the well-being of others, they are operating from their shadow rather than from genuine divine connection. The sixth red flag involves the creation of spiritual drama and manufactured miracles. Genuine spiritual experiences and divine interventions certainly occur, but they typically come with a sense of peace, authenticity, and focus on God's glory rather than human recognition. False spiritual teachers often create theatrical spiritual experiences designed to impress followers and establish their spiritual credibility rather than genuinely ministering to people's needs. This manufactured spirituality can take many forms. They might stage healing encounters that appear miraculous but lack genuine transformation, create prophetic words that sound impressive but contain only generic information that could apply to anyone, or orchestrate spiritual experiences that produce emotional highs but no lasting spiritual fruit. The focus is on creating spectacular moments that build their reputation rather than on authentic spiritual growth and character development. Watch for spiritual teachers who seem to have an unusual number of dramatic spiritual encounters, who always seem to be at the center of miraculous events, or whose spiritual experiences consistently draw attention to their own spiritual gifts rather than pointing people toward direct relationship with the divine. While God certainly works through individuals, authentic spiritual servants typically deflect attention away from themselves and toward divine glory. False spiritual guides often become addicted to being seen as spiritually powerful or specially anointed. They may exaggerate spiritual experiences, embellish miraculous stories, or take credit for divine interventions that they had little or no role in facilitating. This need for spiritual recognition reveals an ego-driven motivation rather than genuine desire to serve divine purposes. Another warning sign is the pressure to have immediate spiritual experiences or to demonstrate spiritual gifts in artificial ways. False teachers might pressure followers to speak in tongues, receive prophecies, or experience divine encounters according to predetermined timelines or methods. Genuine spiritual experiences cannot be manufactured on demand and typically occur according to divine timing rather than human pressure or expectation. Jung recognized that authentic spiritual experiences are characterized by their transformative effect on character and relationships rather than by their dramatic or supernatural appearance. When spiritual encounters consistently produce pride, division, or attention-seeking behavior rather than humility, love, and service, they are likely originating from human manipulation rather than divine intervention. The seventh and most insidious red flag is the sophisticated use of partial truth mixed with deception to create spiritual confusion. This is perhaps the most dangerous form of spiritual manipulation because it appears so close to authentic spiritual guidance that even mature believers can be deceived. False spiritual teachers who operate at this level often have genuine spiritual knowledge, may have had authentic spiritual experiences in the past, and typically mix solid spiritual truth with subtle deceptions that serve their personal agenda. This sophisticated deception is what makes certain false teachers so dangerous and difficult to detect. They might teach 80% truth and 20% deception, making it almost impossible to identify the false elements without careful discernment and comparison with established spiritual wisdom. They often have charismatic personalities, impressive spiritual credentials, and the ability to provide genuine spiritual insight alongside their manipulative agenda. The mixture of truth and deception serves several purposes. It establishes credibility and trust by demonstrating genuine spiritual knowledge. It confuses followers who recognize the truth elements but cannot identify the deceptive components, and it provides cover for the false teacher's true agenda by surrounding it with authentic spiritual content. This creates a spiritual environment where followers become increasingly dependent on the teacher's interpretation of truth rather than developing their own discernment. Watch for teachers who seem to have an unusual need to be the primary source of spiritual truth for their followers. While they may encourage Bible study, prayer, and spiritual disciplines, they subtly position themselves as the ultimate interpreter of divine will for their students. They create an environment where their guidance becomes essential for understanding God's purposes, making important decisions, or achieving spiritual maturity. These sophisticated false teachers often target spiritually hungry individuals who are seeking deeper relationship with God or greater spiritual understanding. They provide legitimate spiritual nourishment mixed with subtle poison, gradually shifting followers away from direct dependence on divine guidance toward dependence on human interpretation and authority. The most dangerous aspect of this level of deception is that it often produces some genuine spiritual fruit alongside the manipulation. People may experience real spiritual growth, authentic divine encounters, or legitimate spiritual gifts, while simultaneously being drawn into unhealthy spiritual dependency or even spiritual abuse. This makes it extremely difficult for followers to recognize the deception because they can point to genuine spiritual benefits they have received. Jung understood that the most effective deceptions are those that contain substantial truth mixed with subtle lies. He recognized that our shadow can coexist with genuine spiritual gifts and experiences, meaning that someone can be genuinely gifted spiritually while simultaneously operating from unintegrated darkness in other areas. This is why spiritual discernment requires looking at the overall pattern of someone's character and behavior rather than focusing only on their spiritual gifts or experiences. To protect yourself from this sophisticated level of spiritual deception, always remember that authentic spiritual authority points you toward direct relationship with God rather than creating dependency on human guidance. Genuine spiritual teachers work themselves out of a job by empowering you to hear divine voice for yourself, while false teachers create increasing dependency on their interpretation and guidance. Pay attention to the long-term fruit in your life and relationships. Authentic spiritual guidance produces increasing freedom, peace, love, and spiritual maturity over time. If you find yourself becoming more anxious, dependent, isolated, or spiritually insecure, despite receiving spiritual teaching, this may indicate that the guidance contains deceptive elements, even if it also includes genuine truth. Always test spiritual guidance against established spiritual principles, seek confirmation through multiple sources, and maintain relationships with other mature believers who can provide outside perspective on your spiritual journey. Remember that divine truth is consistent, coherent, and always produces the fruit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control in those who embrace it. The most important protection against spiritual deception is developing your own intimate relationship with the divine and learning to recognize authentic divine guidance through personal experience. No human teacher, no matter how gifted or well-intentioned, can substitute for your own direct connection to divine truth and love. Carl Jung's insights into the human psyche remind us that we all have shadow aspects that we must acknowledge and integrate, including those who serve in spiritual leadership. The most dangerous spiritual guides are often those who have not done their own inner work and remain unconscious of their shadow motivations while positioning themselves as spiritual authorities. Remember that genuine spiritual servants are characterized by humility, accountability, transparency, and a consistent pattern of pointing others toward divine truth rather than toward themselves. They welcome questions, encourage spiritual independence, maintain appropriate boundaries, and demonstrate the fruit of genuine spiritual maturity through their character and relationships. As you continue your spiritual journey, trust your divine-given intuition and discernment. If something feels off about a spiritual teacher or guide, pay attention to that inner warning, even if you cannot immediately identify what concerns you. Your spiritual intuition is one of your most important protections against deception, and learning to trust and develop this divine gift will serve you well throughout your life. Thank you for joining us on this crucial exploration of spiritual discernment. These 7 red flags could protect you from spiritual manipulation and help you identify authentic divine guidance in your life. Remember to subscribe to the Carl Jung's Inner Sanctum channel for more content on spiritual awareness and psychological protection. May you be blessed with wisdom, discernment, and authentic spiritual growth as you continue your journey toward divine truth.